It was my second month working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store just off a desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest. The pay wasn't great, but I liked the quiet. Most nights, I'd pass the hours stocking shelves, sipping on bad coffee, and trying to ignore the eerie hum of the fluorescent lights. It was the kind of job where nothing much happened until it did. It was a Tuesday, around 2:30 a.m. The night had been unusually quiet, even for that time. No trucks pulling in, no late-night snackers, just an empty parking lot under a pale moon and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I was at the counter scrolling through my phone when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up, expecting a tired trucker or maybe a college kid. Instead, a man stepped inside. He wore a faded brown coat that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. His face was pale, his cheeks hollow, and his eyes, God, his eyes. They were sunken and dull, but they seemed to bore right into me. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't reply. He just nodded slightly and wandered toward the back of the store, his movements slow and deliberate. Something about him put me on edge, but I brushed it off. Weird people showed up sometimes during the graveyard shift. It came with the territory. A few minutes passed. I could hear him moving around in the back, but he wasn't coming up to the register. I craned my neck to see what he was doing, but he was out of sight. The hairs on my neck stood up as I realized how quiet it had gotten. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence. "Sir, do you need help with anything?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Grabbing the flashlight we kept behind the counter, I decided to check on him. As I walked toward the back, the aisles seemed to stretch longer than usual. The air felt heavy, like I was walking underwater. When I turned the corner, the man was gone. I stared at the empty aisle, my heart hammering in my chest. I checked the bathroom, the storage room, even outside. He was nowhere. I stood there for a moment, gripping the flashlight, trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined him. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The bell above the door hadn't rung again. The man never left. I hurried back to the counter and scanned the security monitors. The cameras showed the store from every angle, but there was no sign of him. My hands shook as I rewound the footage to when he entered. There he was, clear as day, walking in. But as I watched, I noticed something horrifying. His reflection didn't appear on the glass doors as he entered. I froze, replaying the footage over and over, hoping I was wrong. But no, it was the same every time. He walked in, and the glass behind him showed nothing. My breath quickened. Suddenly, the lights in the store flickered. I jumped, almost dropping the flashlight. The hum of the fluorescents grew louder, like an angry swarm of bees. Then the lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No response. The flashlight's weak beam was my only source of light as I slowly moved toward the counter. My footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from one of the aisles. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The shuffling stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, a low, guttural whisper filled the air. "You shouldn't be here." I whipped around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. The voice sounded close, too close, as if it had come from right behind me. I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I got there, it wouldn't budge. I twisted the lock, pulled with all my strength, but it was like the door was sealed shut. Panic set in as I turned back toward the store. That's when I saw him. The man in the brown coat was standing at the end of the far aisle, barely illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. His eyes, now glowing faintly, locked onto mine. "Why are you running?" he asked, his voice distorted and echoing. I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "What do you want?" I yelled. He didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, just like before. But his movements were wrong, jerky, like a puppet on strings. I backed away, my heart racing, until I hit the counter. He was getting closer. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed the only weapon I could find, a heavy metal stapler from under the counter, and threw it at him. It hit him square in the chest, but he didn't even flinch. Instead, he let out a laugh, low and chilling, that echoed through the store. Then he vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone. The lights flickered back on, and the store was as empty as it had been when my shift started. The doorbell jingled, and when I turned around, the front door was wide open. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and bolted out of there, not even bothering to clock out. I drove home shaking, my mind racing with what had just happened. The next day I told my manager everything. She just gave me a skeptical look and said, "You're not the first to see him." Apparently, the store had a history. Decades ago, a man had been found dead in the back room. Some said he was a drifter. Others claimed he was a wanted criminal. No one knew for sure. But ever since, strange things had been happening during the night shift. Employees quitting without notice, customers reporting odd occurrences, and sightings of a man in a brown coat. I didn't stick around to become part of the legend. I quit that same day and never went back. Sometimes, though, when I'm driving late at night and pass by that stretch of highway, I glance toward the store and then, I swear, I see someone standing by the window, watching.
Story number 2.
It was my first week as a security guard at an old factory on the outskirts of town. The place was massive, with endless rows of rusted machinery, empty corridors, and a silence so oppressive it seemed to seep into your bones. They told me the factory had been abandoned for years and was only recently bought by a real estate developer. My job was simple: patrol the property during the night shift and make sure no one was trespassing. Easy money, right? I couldn't have been more wrong. The first few nights were uneventful, just me, my flashlight, and the distant creak of the wind. But on the fourth night, something changed. I arrived at 11 p.m. as usual and signed in at the small security booth near the entrance. My boss, an older man named Gary, gave me a quick nod as he handed me the keys. "Keep an eye on the second floor," he said, almost as an afterthought. "That's where the weird stuff happens." I laughed nervously, thinking he was just messing with the new guy, but his face stayed serious. "Weird how?" I asked. Gary hesitated before replying. "Footsteps, voices, you'll see." I didn't press him further. I just grabbed the keys and headed inside. The factory was even creepier at night. The air was cold, the kind of chill that sank into your skin no matter how many layers you wore. The only light came from my flashlight, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the cracked concrete walls. The first hour of my patrol was uneventful. I checked the main floor, making sure the doors and windows were secure. Then I made my way to the second floor, where Gary had warned me. The second floor was worse than the first. Dark, cramped, and filled with old machinery that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The air was heavier up there, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, just a soft tap, tap, tap echoing in the distance. I froze, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was probably just the building settling, or maybe a stray animal. I kept walking, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Tap, 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 like someone was following me. "Who's there?" I demanded, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. No answer. I turned the corner, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A shadow at the far end of the hallway, standing perfectly still. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching me. My heart pounded as I slowly approached, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But when I got closer, the figure disappeared, vanishing like smoke into the air. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was just tired. Yeah, that had to be it. But then I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. But as I stood there, it grew louder, more distinct. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping and incomprehensible. "Leave," one voice hissed, cutting through the cacophony. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted down the hallway, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that sound. My footsteps echoed in the empty factory as I raced down the stairs and burst through the front doors. I didn't stop running until I reached the security booth. Gary was gone, but his chair was still spinning slightly, as if he'd left in a hurry. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone to call him, but before I could dial, I noticed something. The monitor. The security cameras were still running, showing various angles of the factory. I glanced at the screen that covered the second floor, and my blood ran cold. The shadow was there, standing in the same spot I'd seen it earlier, but this time it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadows moved around it, their distorted shapes writhing like smoke. They all turned toward the camera as if they knew I was watching, and then the screen went black. I didn't finish my shift that night. I didn't even go back to the factory to turn in my keys. I quit the next morning and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispering. It's faint, almost inaudible, but it's there. And every time I hear it, I can't help but feel like those shadows are still watching me, waiting for me to come back.
Story number 3.
It started with a simple Craigslist ad. Night cleaner needed, $200 per night. No questions asked. I was broke, desperate, and the pay was too good to ignore. The location was an old office building downtown, one of those tall, imposing structures with tinted windows that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I showed up at 10 p.m. sharp, just as the ad requested. The man who met me in the lobby was unnervingly ordinary, middle-aged, thinning hair, cheap suit. He handed me a set of keys and a clipboard with a list of tasks. Just stick to the checklist, he said, not meeting my eyes, and no matter what, don't go to the 13th floor. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. Wait, there's a 13th floor? His jaw tightened. Just don't go up there. Finish by 4 a.m. Lock the doors when you leave. Before I could ask any more questions, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the dimly lit lobby. The first few hours were uneventful. The tasks were standard: emptying trash bins, vacuuming, wiping down surfaces. The building was eerily quiet, and the only sounds were the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant groan of the elevator cables. By 1 a.m., I was nearly done with the 12th floor. As I collected trash from one of the offices, I noticed something strange on the wall. A series of deep scratches ran from the floor to the ceiling, as if some massive animal had clawed at it. I shivered and quickly moved on, trying to ignore the creeping unease. But then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from above. The 13th floor. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe a bird that had somehow gotten trapped. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth. Curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I decided to take a quick look. The elevator refused to go to the 13th floor. So I found the stairwell and started climbing. As I reached the door marked 13, I hesitated. The air was colder here, and the faint smell of rot made my stomach churn. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. The 13th floor was nothing like the rest of the building. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the plaster with what looked like nails. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows, and the floor was empty. Completely empty. No desks, no chairs, just a vast open space with a single window at the far end. I was about to turn back when I noticed something on the floor near the window. It was a trail of dark, wet footprints leading from the stairwell to the window, but there was no one there. As I stared, the lights flickered again, and for a split second I saw something. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing by the window. Its face was pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide in a grotesque grin. The lights flickered once more, and it was gone. I bolted for the stairwell, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut in my face. I fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the rhythmic thudding started again. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The footprints were moving, fresh ones appearing on the floor, one after the other coming straight toward me. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the stairwell door. The footsteps stopped. I turned back, and the figure was there, standing just a few feet away, its head tilted to the side as it regarded me, that horrible grin never wavering. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. I don't know how I got out. One moment I was trapped, and the next I was stumbling out into the lobby, gasping for air. The man who had hired me was waiting, his expression grim. "You went to the 13th floor, didn't you?" I couldn't speak, I just nodded. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're lucky it let you leave." I quit that night. Weeks later, I saw a news report about the building. A maintenance worker had gone missing, last seen during a night shift. The authorities found his tools on the 13th floor, but no sign of him. They sealed the building shortly after, claiming structural issues. But I know the truth. Something is still up there, pacing back and forth, waiting for the next person who's foolish enough to ignore the warning.
Story number 4.
I was a rideshare driver, working late-night shifts to make extra cash. Most nights were uneventful, tipsy bar hoppers, quiet commuters, and the occasional oddball. But one night, I picked up a passenger I'll never forget. It was around 2 a.m., and I was parked near a gas station waiting for a ride request. The app pinged, and I saw the pickup just a few blocks away. The profile picture was blank, and the name just said, unknown. I hesitated for a second, but the promise of a long trip and good money convinced me to accept. I pulled up to the location, a quiet, dimly lit street lined with old, decrepit houses. No one was outside, but as I waited, I noticed movement in the rearview mirror. A man was walking toward my car from the shadows. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a dark coat that hung loosely on his skeletal frame. His face was pale, almost gray, with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. He opened the door and slid into the back seat without a word. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "Where to?" He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a piece of paper. It was yellowed and crumpled, with an address scrawled in shaky handwriting. "All right," I said, punching it into the GPS. The destination was over an hour away, out in the middle of nowhere. I felt a twinge of unease, but brushed it off. As we drove, the silence in the car grew oppressive. He didn't speak, didn't look at his phone, didn't even fidget. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. About 20 minutes into the ride, I tried to make small talk. "Long night?" I asked, glancing at him in the mirror. His eyes met mine, and I immediately regretted it. They were cold, lifeless, like the eyes of a predator. He didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. The air in the car felt heavier. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I focused on the road, counting the miles until I could drop him off. That's when I noticed something strange. The GPS was glitching, the map flickering on the screen. The estimated time to arrival kept changing, sometimes adding minutes, sometimes subtracting them, and then the address disappeared entirely. "What the hell?" I muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. I turned to the man in the back seat. "Hey, your address isn't showing up anymore. Do you have another?" He was gone. The back seat was empty. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. The door hadn't opened, the seatbelt hadn't unlatched. It was like he had just vanished. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no apps, just static. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural whisper coming from the back seat. "You shouldn't have stopped." I spun around, but the seat was still empty. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling the car like a swarm of bees. "Keep driving." Terrified, I slammed the car into gear and sped off, not knowing where I was going, just desperate to get away. The road seemed endless, stretching into the darkness. My headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had suddenly appeared. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more chaotic, until they were deafening. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I looked around and realized I was no longer on the highway. The road was narrow and lined with trees, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The GPS was still blank, but the car was somehow moving on its own, the steering wheel turning without my input. Ahead, I saw a house. It was old, its windows dark and broken, the front door hanging off its hinges. The car rolled to a stop in front of it, and the engine died. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The passenger's voice echoed in my head again, clear and cold. "Come inside." I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at that house. Eventually, I worked up the courage to get out of the car, but I didn't go inside. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. When I finally made it back to the main road, my phone lit up again. The GPS worked, and I was able to call for help. The police found my car abandoned in front of the house. When they searched the property, they found no sign of anyone. No man, no whispers. But they did find something in the back seat, a crumpled piece of yellowed paper with the words, "You'll be back." I quit driving after that. No amount of money is worth the nightmares I've had since that night. And sometimes, when I'm out late, I swear I can still hear that voice whispering in the distance, telling me to come back.
Story number 5.
I worked as a dispatcher for a small-town 911 call center. The job was stressful, but I was used to strange calls, panicked parents, false alarms, even prank calls from bored kids. But one night I got a call that still haunts me. It was a quiet Tuesday, just past 3 a.m. I was sipping my third cup of coffee, trying to stay awake, when the phone rang. 911, what's your emergency? I answered, my voice calm and professional. There was silence on the other end. Then, a faint, static-filled whisper. They're in the house. A chill ran down my spine. Ma'am, can you repeat that? Who's in the house? More static. Then the voice came back, trembling and barely audible. "They're watching me." I immediately flagged the call for priority response and pulled up the caller's location. It traced back to an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. I relayed the address to the nearest patrol car and stayed on the line. "Ma'am, help is on the way. Can you tell me where you are in the house?" "The closet," she whispered. "Upstairs." "Okay, stay where you are. Keep the door closed and stay quiet. Can you tell me how many people are in the house?" Her breathing grew more frantic. "I don't know. They're not people." I paused, unsure of what she meant. "Ma'am, what do you mean? Are you saying they're animals or something else?" The line crackled, and then she said something that made my blood run cold. "They don't have faces." I didn't know how to respond to that. Before I could say anything, I heard a loud thud through the phone, followed by her muffled scream. "Ma'am, are you there? What's happening?" The line went dead. I frantically updated the responding officers, urging them to hurry. Minutes later, they arrived at the farmhouse. I listened intently as they entered the house, their radios crackling with tension. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. We're inside. House appears empty, but we'll sweep the area." I waited, heart pounding, as they moved room to room. "Upstairs is clear," Reynolds reported. "No sign of anyone in the closet or anywhere else." I frowned, confused. "The caller said she was in the upstairs closet. Are you sure there's no one there?" "Positive," Reynolds replied. "But, dispatch, there's something you need to see." "What is it?" I asked. "On the wall of the closet, there are scratches, deep ones like claw marks, and there's something written here." My stomach tightened. "What does it say?" Reynolds hesitated before answering. "It says, 'They're watching.'" A cold silence filled the line. I asked them to check the rest of the house, but they found no trace of the caller or anyone else. The phone records showed the call had come from the farmhouse's landline. But here's the thing. The farmhouse had been abandoned for years. The officers left, and the case was filed as unresolved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A week later, I was working another late shift when the phone rang again. 911, what's your emergency? Static. Then the same faint whisper, "They're watching me." I froze, my hand gripping the phone. "Ma'am, where are you calling from?" Silence. Then in a voice that wasn't quite human, she said, "You should leave." The line went dead. I quit the next day. Whatever was out there, whatever was in that house, I wanted no part of it. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear the faint sound of static, and I can't help but wonder if they're watching me now.
Story number 6.
I was a nurse working the graveyard shift at a small hospital in rural Kentucky. Night shifts were usually quiet, just me, a skeleton crew, and the hum of fluorescent lights. But one night, I had an encounter that made me question everything I thought I knew about life and death. It was around 2 a.m., when the call light for room 306 blinked on at the nurse's station. Room 306 was at the end of the hall, isolated and rarely used. It had been empty for weeks due to renovations, but the light was unmistakable. I thought it was just a glitch, but protocol required me to check. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the dimly lit hallway. The air grew colder as I approached the room, and the faint smell of antiseptic gave way to something metallic, like blood. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Finally, I pushed it open. The room was dark, the bed stripped bare, just as I'd expected. But then I noticed something odd. The rocking chair in the corner was moving, creaking softly as it rocked back and forth. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. The chair stopped moving. The room was empty, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint, raspy whisper. "Help me." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "Who's there?" The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. In the dim light, I saw her. A woman stood at the foot of the bed. Her skin was pale and mottled, her eyes sunken and hollow. She wore a hospital gown stained with something dark, and her lips moved as she whispered, "Help me." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Who are you? What do you need?" She lifted a hand, pointing to the wall. "Behind there," she said, her voice barely audible. I turned to look at the wall, and when I turned back, she was gone. Terrified but unable to ignore her plea, I reported the incident to my supervisor. At first, she brushed it off as exhaustion, but I insisted they check behind the wall. The maintenance team arrived the next morning and began tearing into the plaster. What they found still haunts me. Behind the wall was a small hidden compartment, and inside were human remains. A skeleton curled into a fetal position. The forensics team determined it was a woman who had likely been bricked into the wall decades ago. No one could explain how the call light had activated or how I'd seen her that night. But after they removed the remains, the activity in room 306 stopped. I transferred to a different hospital shortly after. But sometimes when I pass an empty room or hear the faint creak of a rocking chair, I remember her face, and I wonder how many others are still waiting to be found.
Story number 7.
I used to work as a security guard for an abandoned mall on the outskirts of town. The place had been shut down for years after a fire broke out in the food court, but the structure remained intact, looming like a ghost over the empty parking lot. My job was simple: patrol the mall, check for squatters, and report anything unusual. The company paid well, and I figured it would be an easy gig. My shifts were mostly quiet, but the mall had a strange, oppressive atmosphere. The air always felt heavy, and even with a flashlight, the shadows seemed darker than they should be. One night, everything changed. It was around 3 a.m. when I started my usual rounds. I walked through the main concourse, my footsteps echoing eerily against the cracked tiles. The mannequins in the boarded-up stores looked like frozen sentinels, their blank faces catching the light in unsettling ways. I was halfway through my shift when I heard it. A faint laugh. It was high-pitched, almost like a child's giggle, and it came from the direction of the old carousel in the mall's center court. My heart skipped a beat. I was the only one there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or an animal that had gotten inside, but something compelled me to check it out. As I approached the carousel, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the air and my flashlight flickered. The carousel, long out of commission, was eerily intact, the painted horses frozen mid-gallop, and then to my horror it started moving. The carousel creaked to life, the platform spinning slowly, its haunting melody echoing through the empty mall. I froze, unable to move as the painted horses bobbed up and down. That's when I saw her. A little girl was sitting on one of the horses, her pale hands gripping the pole. Her dress was tattered, and her long hair obscured her face. She didn't look up, didn't move, just sat there as the carousel turned. I finally found my voice. "Hey, what are you doing here? This place is closed." She lifted her head slowly, and I felt my stomach drop. Her eyes were hollow sockets, black as the void, and her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. "Play with me," she whispered. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the ground. The carousel spun faster, the music growing distorted, almost frantic. "No!" I shouted, turning to run. As I sprinted down the concourse, I heard her laughter echoing behind me, growing louder and more manic. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, chasing me, trying to pull me back. I finally reached the exit, throwing myself against the heavy doors. They burst open and I stumbled into the cold night air. I quit the next morning, refusing to ever step foot in that mall again. A few months later, I learned the truth. Decades ago, before the mall was built, there had been a small amusement park on the property. A little girl had died on the carousel, crushed when the machinery malfunctioned. No one believed me when I told them what I saw. But every now and then, I hear rumors from other security guards. They all say the same thing. The little girl is still there, waiting for someone to play with her.
Story number 8.
I used to work as a night janitor at an old hotel downtown. It wasn't the kind of place where people came to stay for fun. It was mostly travelers passing through or people down on their luck. The building itself was over 100 years old, and you could feel its history in the creaking floors and the faint smell of mildew. My shift started at midnight and ended at 7 a.m. Most nights were uneventful. Cleaning empty halls, wiping down dusty furniture, and taking out the trash. But one night, I discovered why so many of the hotel's employees refused to work the night shift. It was around 2 a.m. when I got a call from the front desk. The clerk said a guest in room 409 had complained about someone knocking on their door and whispering. The odd part? Room 409 had been vacant for weeks. I grabbed my keys and flashlight and took the stairs up to the 4th floor. That floor always felt colder than the rest of the building, and the air had a stillness to it that made my skin crawl. When I reached room 409, the door was slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight inside. The room was empty, just as I'd expected, but the bedspread was rumpled and the curtains swayed lightly, even though the windows were closed. I stepped inside to check the room. That's when I noticed something strange. The mirror above the dresser. It wasn't reflecting the room correctly. In the mirror, the bed was neatly made, the curtains were still, and the door was shut tight. But what caught my attention most was the figure standing in the corner of the reflection. A woman in a long black dress, her face obscured by a veil. I spun around, heart racing, but the corner of the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. A loud knock startled me, echoing from the door. I turned, expecting to see the front desk clerk or maybe another guest. But the hallway was empty. The knock came again, this time from inside the room. I backed away, fumbling for the door handle. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard it, a faint, mournful wail, like someone crying far away. I slammed the door shut and called the front desk. The clerk sounded annoyed, as if this wasn't the first time someone had reported strange activity in that room. After that, I avoided the fourth floor whenever I could, but the hotel didn't make it easy. My nightly rounds still took me past room 409, and every time I felt like I was being watched. A few weeks later, I overheard a housekeeper talking about the room. She said it used to belong to a woman who stayed there for years after her husband disappeared. She'd wait for him every night, sitting by the window in her black dress. When the hotel tried to evict her, she locked herself inside and never came out. They found her body months later. Now, whenever guests stay in room 409, they report the same thing: knocking, whispers, and the feeling of someone watching them. I quit that job not long after. But sometimes when I walk past old buildings at night, I swear I see a figure in the window, a woman in black, waiting for someone who will never come home.
Story number 9.
I used to live in a small town where everyone knew everyone. It was quiet, safe, boring even. But just outside the town limits was an abandoned church that everyone avoided. The church, built in the 1800s, had been the site of a tragedy. During a Sunday service, a fire broke out, trapping the congregation inside. Nearly everyone perished, and the few survivors left town, unable to face the memories. Over time, the church fell into disrepair, its charred steeple looming over the surrounding woods like a grim reminder. Local kids loved to scare each other with stories about the place. Some said you could hear the choir singing at night. Others claimed to see shadowy figures in the windows. I didn't believe any of it until I experienced it myself. One fall evening, my friend Eric dared me to explore the church with him. It was the typical teenage bravado. Don't be a chicken, and it's just an old building. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We arrived just before midnight, flashlights in hand. The air was colder than it should have been for that time of year, and the woods around the church were eerily silent. The door creaked loudly as we pushed it open. Inside, the pews were overturned, and the altar was blackened by soot. Cobwebs hung from the rafters, and the smell of decay lingered in the air. "See?" Eric said, his voice echoing. "Just a creepy old church. Nothing to be scared of." I wasn't so sure. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. It was as if the building itself was watching us. We were about to leave when Eric noticed a door near the back. It was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading down. "Bet there's a crypt down there," Eric said, grinning. "Let's just go," I replied, but he was already heading down. Reluctantly, I followed. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom was a small, circular room with a single stone table in the center. "Looks like some kind of altar," Eric said, running his hand over the surface. That's when we heard it. A faint humming, low and melodic like a hymn sung by unseen voices. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Eric nodded, his grin fading. The humming grew louder, and the room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. Shadows flickered in the corners, though our flashlights were steady. "Let's get out of here," Eric said, finally sounding as scared as I felt. We turned to leave, but the staircase was gone. In its place was a solid wall of stone. Panic set in. We banged on the wall, shouted for help, but the humming only grew louder, now accompanied by faint whispers. "They're here," a voice said, clear and close, though there was no one in the room but us. I spun around, and that's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their faces burned and disfigured, their eyes hollow. They moved slowly, their mouths opening and closing, as if trying to scream. Eric and I backed against the wall, too terrified to move. One of the figures raised a hand, pointing at us. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. The next thing I knew, I was outside, lying on the ground. Eric was beside me, pale and trembling. We didn't speak as we ran back to town, never once looking back. I don't know how we escaped, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that faint humming, and I remember their burned faces. I haven't gone near that church since, and I never will. Some places are meant to be left alone.
Story number 10.
I never thought I'd end up as one of those people with a terrifying story to tell. I used to love hearing about ghost stories and urban legends, especially the kind that happened during the night shift. I worked as a security guard at an old hospital that had been converted into an office building. It was creepy, sure, but I never believed in ghosts. At least, not until that one night. The building was massive, with long, empty corridors, flickering lights, and floors that creaked even when no one was walking on them. My job was to patrol the entire place, checking for anything unusual. Easy money, or so I thought. It was about 2 in the morning when I first heard it. A soft, distant whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind outside. But as I walked down one of the darker hallways on the 4th floor, the whisper became clearer. It sounded like a woman's voice, faint but unmistakable, saying, "Help me." My heart raced. I stopped in my tracks and shined my flashlight around. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but old desks and chairs. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed eerily, but there was no response. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and continued my patrol. About an hour later, I was in the basement, a place I always dreaded going. The air down there was heavy and damp, and the dim emergency lights barely lit the space. As I walked past the old morgue, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. "Help me," the voice said, trembling and desperate. It came from inside the morgue. Every instinct in my body told me to run, but my sense of duty, or maybe my curiosity, kept me rooted. I pushed open the heavy metal door, its creak sounding like a scream in the silence. The morgue was empty, as it should have been. No bodies, no people, nothing. Then the lights flickered. For a split second, they went out completely. When they came back on, I saw her. A woman in a hospital gown stood at the far end of the room. Her hair was tangled, her face pale, and her eyes, God, her eyes were hollow and dark. She raised a trembling hand and pointed at me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, but she didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "You have to help me," and then disappeared. I ran. I didn't care about my job or the patrol. I bolted up the stairs, heart pounding, and locked myself in the security office. For the rest of the shift, I stayed glued to the surveillance monitors, but the cameras didn't show anything unusual. No woman, no movement, nothing. The next morning, I told my supervisor about what happened. He laughed it off and said I'd probably dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. But I knew what I saw. I decided to do some digging. The building had a dark history. Before it became an office space, it had been a hospital for nearly 50 years. In the 1970s, a nurse named Clara had disappeared during her shift. According to the old records I found online, she was last seen heading toward the morgue to deliver a patient's belongings. Her body was never found. The story chilled me to my core, but it didn't stop me from going back to work. I needed the paycheck. For the next few nights, everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. One night, while reviewing the camera feeds, I noticed something strange. In one of the hallways, a chair started moving on its own. It slid a few inches, stopped, and then flipped over as if someone had kicked it. I rewound the footage several times, trying to figure out what I was seeing, but there was no one there. That was the same night I started hearing footsteps following me during my patrols. They were soft at first, almost like an echo, but then they grew louder. I'd turn around, flashlight ready, but there was never anyone there. The whispers came back too, more frequent and more desperate. I didn't tell anyone this time. What could I say? That the ghost of a missing nurse was haunting me? I was sure they'd think I was crazy, or worse, fire me. The breaking point came about a week later. I was in the break room trying to calm my nerves with a cup of coffee when the power went out. The emergency lights kicked in, casting long shadows across the room. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the fuse box in the basement. I'll never forget what I saw down there. As I approached the fuse box, I noticed a pool of water on the floor. It hadn't rained in weeks, and there were no pipes in that part of the building. Then I saw her again, Clara. She was standing in the water, staring at me with those hollow eyes. This time, her gown was soaked, and her hair dripped as if she'd just stepped out of a river. "Please," she whispered, her voice echoing off the walls, "help me." Before I could move, the temperature dropped, and my breath became visible. My flashlight flickered, and then I felt it, a cold hand gripping my wrist. I screamed and yanked my arm away, falling backward onto the wet floor. When I looked up, she was gone. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I made it back to the security office and called my supervisor, babbling about how I couldn't work there anymore. I quit on the spot. Even now, years later, I can still hear her voice sometimes when I'm alone at night. Help me. It's a plea I'll never be able to answer.
Story number 11.
I always thought working the night shift at a 24-hour diner would be uneventful. It was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty roads and dense woods. Most nights were quiet, with a few truckers or late-night travelers stopping by for coffee and a burger. That's why the night it happened still haunts me. It started like any other shift. The usual customers had come and gone, and by 2 a.m. I was alone, wiping down the counters. The only sound was the hum of the fridge and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside. Then the bell over the door jingled. A man walked in. He looked normal enough. Dark jacket, jeans, baseball cap, pulled low. But something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he avoided making eye contact or the way his movements were too stiff, too deliberate. He sat at the counter, and I forced a smile. "Coffee?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't say a word. I poured him a cup and slid it over. He stared at it for a moment before finally speaking. His voice was low, almost a growl. "You ever see something you wish you hadn't?" The question caught me off guard. Can't say that I have," I said, trying to keep things light. "Why? Have you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his coffee and took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the diner where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at him, he was staring at me. "Don't go outside tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what you hear." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. All right. Sure thing. Anything else I can get you?" He shook his head and stood up, leaving a crumpled bill on the counter. Then he walked out, disappearing into the darkness. I watched him go, the uneasy feeling in my gut growing stronger. A few minutes later, I heard it, a soft tapping on the front window. I turned, expecting to see the man again, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the sickly glow of the diner's neon lights. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder. It wasn't coming from the front window, but from the side, where the lights didn't reach. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached, peering out into the night. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the breeze. Then the tapping came again, now from the back door. My heart raced as I crept toward the kitchen. The back door had a small, frosted window, and I could see the faint outline of a figure standing on the other side. "We're closed," I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its outline blurry but unmistakably human. "Go away," I shouted. But the tapping continued, more insistent now. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but the line crackled and went dead before I could say a word. Panic set in as the tapping turned into pounding, the door shaking with every hit. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood frozen, clutching the phone, listening to the deafening silence. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I worked up the courage to look out the window again. The figure was gone. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. A low, guttural growl came from behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. In the corner of the kitchen, where the light barely reached, something crouched in the shadows. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's. And its teeth, rows of sharp, jagged teeth, gleamed as it smiled at me. I don't remember screaming, but I must have because my throat burned as I bolted for the front door. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the road, the diner a distant speck behind me. The police found me hours later, wandering in a daze. When they checked the diner, they said it was empty. No signs of a break-in, no strange creatures, just the overturned tables and spilled coffee from my hasty escape. I quit that job the next day. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know this. I'll never work the night shift again.
Story number 12.
I used to work as a gas station attendant on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town. The place was remote, surrounded by cornfields that stretched endlessly into the night. It was one of those old stations with flickering fluorescent lights and a single pump. Most nights were uneventful, just the occasional traveler stopping for gas or snacks. But then came that night. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween. The air was crisp and the station was unusually quiet. The only sound was the hum of the lights and the distant rustle of cornstalks swaying in the wind. I was sitting behind the counter, half watching an old horror movie on the tiny TV, when the door chime rang. I looked up to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, wearing a long coat that looked soaked, even though it hadn't rained in days. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken. He didn't say a word, just walked slowly to the counter and placed a crumpled dollar bill on it. "Pump 2, he muttered, his voice hoarse. I glanced outside. The station only had one pump, and it was right in front of the store. There was no pump 2. I frowned and looked back at him, but he was gone. Just like that. The door hadn't opened again, and there were no footsteps. I stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. The pump was empty. There wasn't a single car in the lot. I shook it off, thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, and went back inside. A few minutes later, the door chime rang again. This time, a woman entered. She looked frantic, her hair wild and her clothes torn. She stumbled to the counter, clutching a torn piece of paper. "Have you seen him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My husband. He's been missing for days." I hesitated. "What does he look like?" She described the man I had just seen, the coat, the pale face, everything. My blood ran cold. I told her I might have seen someone matching that description, but before I could explain, the lights flickered, and then the power went out. The store plunged into darkness. The hum of the lights and the faint noise of the TV were gone, leaving an eerie silence. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the pitch-black store. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone. I called out, but there was no answer. The door hadn't chimed, and I hadn't heard her leave. I shined the flashlight around, but the store was empty. The only sound was the wind howling through the cornfields. Then the phone rang. I picked it up, my hands shaking. "Hello?" At first there was just static. Then a voice came through, faint and distorted. "Don't go outside." Click. The line went dead. My heart was pounding as I turned to the front window. That's when I saw them. Figures standing just beyond the light of the station, barely visible among the tall corn stalks. Dozens of them. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I locked the door and backed away, my flashlight trembling in my grip. But no sooner had I taken a step when I heard a soft tapping on the glass. I turned slowly, and there he was, the man in the coat. He was standing on the other side of the window, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth twisted into a grin that sent chills down my spine. Behind him, the figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster, closing the distance to the station. Their faces were obscured, but their shapes were wrong. Elongated arms, twisted legs, like something out of a nightmare. I ran to the back room and barricaded myself inside, heart racing. I could hear them now, their footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, the tapping turning into pounding as they tried to get in, and then silence. I don't know how long I stayed in that room, hours maybe. When I finally worked up the courage to come out, the station was empty. The lights were back on and everything looked normal, except for one thing. The crumpled dollar bill was still on the counter. But now, it was soaked in blood. In blood. I quit the next day. I never went back to that gas station, and I've avoided cornfields ever since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint sound of tapping.